The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
We're here today with Roy Payne, the Executive Director of GDFWatch. Welcome to Titans of Nuclear.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So, as we always like to do on this show, just love to hear about you and your background and how you got started and how you even found your way into this crazy industry.
Like so many people, it's purely almost by accident. My background is very much from communications and engagement. And I've got a very diverse background, from running political campaigns to large-scale marketing campaigns to doing lobbying and political and public policy campaigns. I've worked inside government for big corporates as well as in the community. And I think it was that breadth of experience that attracted RWM in the United Kingdom to give me the assignment. They had just, in the UK, had just reached a point where the previous search for a site for our geological repository had failed. There'd been a review, and now they were looking at renewing the policy, and they wanted someone to come in who understands communications, stakeholder engagement, and to look at it with fresh eyes. And so I found myself...
What is RWM?
RWM is Radioactive Waste Management, who are the UK's body responsible for final disposal of radioactive waste. And like every country, the UK is undergoing a process of trying to identify a site. Yep. And like every other country in the world, is trying to do it on a consent-based approach, i.e. to get the approval of the local community, which makes it a very different from every other type of infrastructure or nuclear project. Yeah. Because invariably things are going to be built somewhere and you may consult the public locally. Yep. But this actually requires people to agree to the very fact of the facility's existence in the first place, which is a very different and much more complex political and social issue to address.
Well, we'll get into that in a minute, but maybe we can start off with, GDFWatch. What's that organization exactly? How was that formed?
GDFWatch is as much a concept as an organization. I had been employed by RWM as their head of stakeholder engagement to look at the policy, to review how the communications and engagement strategy may work. And I realized as I thought more and more from my own experience and looking at the consent-based elements that other things were required, that it needed to go further. And some of that was challenging nuclear industry perceptions and perspectives. Yeah. And some of that was actually there are constraints upon any public body in the way in which they conduct their business. Yeah. And I felt there needed to be a bit more flexibility in how we explored and discussed this issue. Because government agencies are constrained in the way in which they can speak and talk. But equally, I think a lot of the issues with geological disposal actually do challenge some of the sort of preconceptions and some of the sort of industry think. And I wanted to be outside of that to actually challenge some of those conceptions, not because I thought I had a particular insight. It was really listening to particularly communities and local authorities, ordinary people, and then trying to sort of work back from where their heads were at and what their perspective was. Rather, they didn't want to be lectured to or told what the facts were. As we know, as we can see around us on a daily basis for the past 4 or 5 years, people vote not because they're rational, but because they believe in a set of values or a set of sentiments. And the nuclear sector still primarily communicates through providing information and trying to make people understand that the logic and the science behind what they're doing, where actually people often don't want the logical science. They want a reassurance and they want some addressing of their emotions and their feelings.
Yep. So do you have a good sense for what the history of nuclear waste management in the UK is?
Fairly, yes. I mean, it's been very similar to most other countries. That if we go back to the UK has a particularly long history because we were one of the founding countries of nuclear in terms of research. Sellafield itself, the first civil use of nuclear energy.
Yeah.
And so if we look back into the 40s, 50s, and right through to the 70s and 80s, waste wasn't really considered, or the consequences of the waste wasn't given the same level of thought as it is now. And you look at Sellafield and the way in which previous generations disposed of their waste, we are still very gingerly going through those ponds and very carefully taking out waste from 50, 60 years ago because it was uncatalogued, it wasn't properly stored. And I feel as a citizen that is not something that we should repeat or pass on to another generation. It is something that we should start addressing now.
And why is that? So what I don't understand about the nuclear, and maybe you have some insight into this, the nuclear industry's position around nuclear waste. They treat it as if it's a uniquely hazardous substance when it's not. So for instance, the stuff that's sitting in the ponds for 60 years, by virtue of something even sitting around for 3 months, all of the iodine-131 is gone. And if all the iodine-131 is gone, there's no environmental contamination issues. Because as Chernobyl proved, when it contaminated the environment with every radionuclide that would be in nuclear waste, only iodine-131 proved a threat to human health. And all the iodine-131 is gone in a few months. So why do we care about this at all from a technical perspective?
I can't really speak to, I'm not technical expert enough to speak to the issues of the ponds within Sellafield. But to the more general point about radioactive waste, I think there is some of the work being done in America by the American Association of Physicists is pointing out that some of the standards that we have in terms of radiation protection go way beyond what is actually necessary. But they've been built up in the 70s and 80s when there was a huge distrust of nuclear. Right. And to secure public acceptance, certain standard levels were introduced, not just at international level, as a way of building acceptability to counter what was a very strong public sentiment against nuclear. But I agree with you because I look now and I look at the waste issue generally. Radioactive waste is about the only waste, and I'm not saying we should reduce necessarily the regulatory obligations.
Why not though? Why not? Why not? Because I'm hearing two contradictory things, and I hear this from almost everyone in the industry. They're like, well, maybe our regulations are too strong, but I'm not saying we should reduce them. And they say that with both waste and safety. So if the regulations and the standards are too high, why not reduce them?
I think at this stage, because it's about public acceptability, there's this issue between what's logic and science and what public acceptability is. And before you reduce those standards, you would have to do an awful lot of work with the public to make them feel comfortable.
But shouldn't the standards reflect the scientific reality? And if the standards don't reflect the scientific reality, aren't we lying to the public? Like if you and I both know that the standards are too high and the technical consensus is that the standards are too high, if we keep them too high, we're lying to the public.
Well,
we're not protecting them.
I would see this more as an issue about waste full stop. Radioactive waste being one element. Yeah. Industrial processes, everything that we do as human societies and developing human societies, we produce much waste.
Right.
Most of that waste is not regulated. It is disposed of carelessly without any form of protection to the environment or public health. And we look increasingly at electronic waste and particularly waste from many of the renewable sectors, from solar panels. There is no regulation. That is being largely shipped to poor countries and it's becoming an issue. We've now got China, the Philippines, Malaysia. It's becoming an issue. There's just an article this week from Pakistan. It's becoming a big issue. Less affluent countries. Why are we taking the waste from affluent countries when the waste is dangerous? And much of this waste, of course, unlike radioactive waste, never decays. It is permanently dangerous to both the environment and to humans. Yeah. And I suspect just this is my communications experience rather than necessarily a simple point of logic, is that we probably need to have a discussion about our wastes that we produce. We need to make things. We live in a world where we need energy. We need we want certain products. We want X-ray machines. We want MRI scanners. There are things that we see as beneficial to us, but in making those, we are creating waste which could be toxic and far more toxic than radioactive waste and far more long-lasting. Mm-hmm. And I see that as part of a debate about our responsibility. If we want these things, we need to take responsibility for how we then dispose of the waste. Radioactive waste is part of that process. Mm-hmm. It's the most obvious one. But hopefully within that discussion, we can then start evaluating, well, what is an appropriate regulatory regime? Yeah. And rather than see, because I think it would actually, it would take away from this broader issue about waste and responsibility. Yeah. And this is part of my point with radioactive waste. Radioactive waste does not operate in a vacuum. It is part of our society, it's part of our politics, and we need to understand it within that context rather than just see it as a physical substance which has certain properties which we can identify and that we can build regulations around that. That's absolutely true. But it is about dealing with public sentiment, public emotions, and taking the public with you.
But it seems to me that with this consent-based citing, or by even categorizing it in a domain that requires like having a conversation with the public about it, it seems no matter what you tell them, you're setting yourself up for failure, because through your actions, through saying, hey, this is something we need to have a special conversation about, before you even begin, you're convincing them that this is something that is unique, that this is not like other toxic substances. When in reality, we know it is just like other substances. Some toxins we dilute, some toxins we landfill, but it is the same in terms of a hazard to human health as any other type of waste that we might create. So aren't you afraid that by putting it in a special category, by pulling the public aside and saying, hey, we have to have a special conversation about this, you're just like preparing them to like put this idea in their mind that this is something that's that needs unique considerations?
There are 2 points to that particular question. It's a good question. I think the reality is you're not raising anything with the public. The moment this is universal across the planet. The moment you enter a community and say, I want to have a discussion with you about radioactive waste, you get this already there. It's built into human mindset. Yeah. You get this huge negative reaction.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
You as a nuclear sector are not going out and raising something that isn't there. Yeah. It's latent within the population. And the moment that you open your mouth to talk about the subject, you get this emotional response. Yeah. And that's true of every community right across the world. It's not. Yeah. It's a human response. Yeah. Largely, yes, of course, a lot of it driven through lack of information, instinctive fear. Human beings work on the basis of. I know that nuclear, if it goes wrong, is terrible, but I don't know and understand the risks. But for personal safety, I will shove it as far away from me as possible. Mm-hmm. That is a very basic human, flee or fight defense mechanism. Mm-hmm. I know this can go wrong, and I will, for the time being, on the basis of no information, I'll assign it the worst possible value. Mm-hmm. As my starting point, and you have to bring me backwards and convince me otherwise. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a point there about safety, because if you talk to the nuclear industry, much of the research that has been done, people always say, yeah, well, safety is my first, the first issue. And therefore the industry thinks that safety is a thing to go and lead on. Yeah. Well, actually, no, don't necessarily understand. People say all sorts of things when you ask them, what's the most important to you? Safety. But actually, when you have a discussion with them, safety is not their first issue. Right. I mean, people don't say, what's your first issue? When you think about flying, people tend to think in terms of going to see friends, going on holiday. They don't think about the plane crashing out of the sky. Right. There's an inbuilt assumption that it is safe. Even though once described to me as putting yourself in a pressurized tube, surrounding yourself with highly combustible materials, elevating yourself 6 miles above the planet and propelling yourself at 600 miles an hour, you couldn't necessarily get the health and safety certification these days if the plane was a new concept.
Right.
But
that's exactly right. So what kind of, when you bring this message to the nuclear community, what kind of response do you get when you tell them don't lead with safety? What do they tell you?
You get mixed responses. I think there is an increasing dawning realization within the nuclear sector that the messaging over the past 10, 15, 20, 25 years has been fairly, has been repeated mantra-like repeatedly, but has had no impact. And if you're in communications, that's a very poor return on your investment. If you spend all that money and time and have basically shifted nothing, then clearly that communication, that message isn't working. And this is where, I mean, it does take time, but with geological disposal, the industry is absolutely universally clear. This is not a technical issue. This is a social and political issue. Digging underground facilities, packaging the waste. Technically, there's nothing new. There's no new advanced science here. We can do this very well, and we can show that we can do it. It's a social and political issue. However, when you actually look at the communications campaigns run by many nuclear agencies and by governments, they tend to immediately revert to the safety and the technical description of the project, rather than actually say what is the what are the social and political dimensions, and let's start discussing there. And I suspect, because I've worked in very many different sectors over my life, from media, telecommunications, internet, the energy sector, now in nuclear waste, and each of those sectors has its own way of thinking, its own language, its own culture, its own norms. And I think it is a case of the nuclear sector has got into a habit of wanting to explain the science and hoping that people, largely because I think a lot of the people who work in the nuclear sector come from an academic background, and therefore their culture of imparting knowledge is to, as a teacher, pass on knowledge to students who wish to know more. And that's the sort of mindset they bring to when they're dealing with the population. Well, the wider public are not students. They don't want to learn. They have a different set of demands. And there's two things recently. I mean, slowly the nuclear sector is beginning to address this. There was a large conference at the IAEA in Vienna 18 months ago, which for the first time brought almost 100 mayors and representatives of municipalities from around the world to actually present their views on how they perceive the nuclear sector. And much of that was, you talk at us, not to us. You don't listen. It feels like having a helicopter parent. You don't trust us. And yet in communications terms and in engagement terms, the most likely friends the nuclear sector are going to have are with the municipalities which host nuclear facilities, who are used to working with the nuclear sector, for whom employees work within and live within the community. They contribute to the economy and the cultural life of the community. And nobody lives there who's going to live there in a risk situation. That people understand the risks, how they're being managed, and are very comfortable with how those risks are being managed. So this is an audience who would be very supportive of the sector, but feel that they are still being not treated as a partner, as an equal, still feel like they're being treated, as one delegate put it, as children, that we have to have our hand held all the time. Now, I understand that from the nuclear sector, but this is where the trust, I think, needs to change, because the public themselves have a distrust of government and the nuclear sector, which in many cases is well-founded. If you go back into the 40s, 50s, 60s, the secrecy around that time. But equally, I think the experience in the nuclear sector has been that the public aren't rational, are sometimes difficult, can come and so they've kept the public at more at arm's length, and all of which is understandable. I mean, this is all understandable, but that needs to be bridged in some way.
And so who's responsible for bridging this? Because it's not like you can go to every nuclear scientist and give them a personal communications training and like, are there high leverage points, of where the nuclear industry has interaction with the public that you could take your thesis to and retrain, 10 or 20 or 50 individuals that have the most contact with other people?
I suspect actually it's going to be largely from outside organisations such as Energy Impact Centre, some of the new companies, such if you look at Deep Isolation, new entrants into the marketplace are better placed because they can come with a refreshed attitude. Yeah. It's more difficult to get large governmental, international and big corporate organisations to shift. It probably needs that introduction and the opening up of those pathways. And like so much we see in our economy, it's not the big corporates who make the changes. It's the new entrants who drive change and then show the way forward.
But I'm afraid that they're not getting the message because, okay, for instance, like you mentioned Deep Isolation. In its very title, it says, be scared of my industry. Like Deep and Isolation says, I am dealing with something that is so dangerous that it needs to be isolated. And not only does it need to be isolated, but it needs to be isolated deeply. So like every time someone hears the name of that company, like it evokes a sense of fear of what they're dealing with. And so I don't think they're getting the message. And then there's like another company out there that's, Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation, USNC. They're getting a license up in Canada or something. And literally in the name, it's ultra safe, the exact opposite of what you just said. They led with safety. So how do you, if the newcomers, are not just communicating it correctly, but they literally put it in the title, what do we do then?
Well, when I joined RWM, Radioactive Waste Management in the UK, it was at the time a division of the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, but was being established as a separate entity. Yeah. And there was a lot of thought given to its name. And we did some research around it. And in the end, they chose Radioactive Waste Management. It does what it says on the tin. Yeah. And we're at a stage of perhaps what you might call social or social psychological development. Whereas if we called it something, I don't know, a quantum, or gave it some Chorus, a made-up name that was not value-laden in any way, people would see through that and would actually attach a more negative. Actually saying what you do on the surface, right up front, this is what we do, is actually one of the foundations of building trust. This is not an easy subject. This is, a complex subject. It's very emotional. It's very technical. And we need to have we need to build time to have a conversation. And so actually introducing yourself as who you are when you first arrive, while that may be initially, hang on a moment, that builds up a wall between you and the other person, it's actually a necessary sort of wall to work through. We're in a time of difficult conversations. Sometimes you have to have that difficult conversation to get through to the other side and then to start identifying, well, what is actually a realistic conversation?
So you think that's the best communication strategy, is just put the difficult conversation first, not like build a relationship slowly first, understand values, and then get to the difficult conversation?
I'm not sure you can... If you're going into a community, your community already, you'll have an idea of who they are, but I mean, all these communities effectively are the same. Humans are humans, and there may be local differences that just colour or shade your presentation. But fundamentally, yes, you're going into a into a community, as RWM in the UK will have to do, which is we're looking for a site for a deep geological repository where we're going to place the nation's waste. That you can't get around that conversation. That has to be. This is what we're trying to do. But there are then, and the relationship then comes up, and in the UK, because of the way in which the siting process, which is consent based, is structured. And I know that people in the United States are looking at very closely what's happening in the UK, because of a model is attractive to the United States. But let's see how it actually operates. But a lot of that is about actually empowering the community. It's about having a partnership with the community, that the communities can get involved in this process, but they can walk away. There's an exit strategy for them with no obligation. Now, that's a very important sort of building of trust foundation. We want to have a very difficult conversation with you. You're not tied into this conversation. You can walk away if it proves to be something not attractive to your community. But it's going to take us 20, 30 years before we can really work out what can be done safely. There is so much discussion, so much analysis to be done.
I don't understand. Why does it take 20, 30 years to figure out what can be done safely? Why not just dig a hole and put some 10 feet of dirt on it? That's all you need to isolate waste. I just don't understand. Like, why is it a deep geological repository? Why is there 20, 30 years of studying? This doesn't make any sense from a technical perspective. All the item 131 is gone in 3 months. So why are we treating this as special? Why isn't that the conversation that we're having at first? And saying, hey, nuclear waste is just another form of waste. Let's just landfill.
There are multiple forms of waste, and our low-level waste is already disposed of. We're only looking to put somewhere in the region of 10 to 15% of our total radioactive waste in a deep geological repository, and that is waste that can have half-lives of 100,000 years.
Yeah, but so does the carbon in your body. You have 700 trillion atoms of radioactive C14 in your body that'll last hundreds of thousands of years. That's how we do radiocarbon dating, right? You've heard of radiocarbon dating. We do that because we're all radioactive.
Well, I'm not a technical person, I'm a communications person, and I take the advice of many scientists that this is the way in which the industry. There may be, I hear all sorts of, ideas. I'm not a technical person. I don't seek to pass judgment on whether recycling or repurposing of waste. There are many scientists who believe that we are actually throwing away a very otherwise usable product, and that much of the waste could be recycled. But there will also always ultimately be a residue of waste, no matter how much you recycle, which is so concentrated, and that diluting it is not a solution.
Why isn't it a solution? I can't understand why dilution is not a solution.
I'm not the person who can answer that question for you. I simply am not a technical person. I am about basically trying to build from a community perspective, the public perspective, to engage in a discussion about geological disposal. Now, those issues are not. People at this stage, the first stage, and most people do not want to dive straight into a lot of technical discussion about the dilution or concentrating. They are much more concerned about, well, why is this happening? And what are likely the impacts? What do I have to worry about where I live? Their concerns and issues are much more parochial and personal rather than technical. And the industry itself will employ people to communicate science and technology. I don't see my role as in communicating science and technology. My role is into creating the space in which communities and the sector can start having a discussion in a constructive and organized way where both sides are treated with respect, but also both sides are listening to each other.
So what is that space? Is this a conference hall? Is it an online forum? What's that space you're creating?
It's every conceivable space. I mean,
but literally, what spaces in the last 6 months have you created? I guess
there's been no discussion because of COVID and because of the situation in the UK. The process is only likely to start some point later this year, beginning of next year. How will that emerge? It'll probably start with very small community meetings, small groups of people in physical locations.
In Sellafield, in London, where?
Well, wherever the communities come forward. But I mean, we're advised by the Radioactive Waste Management and the NDA. There are a number of interesting.
The NDA stands for Nuclear Decommissioning
Authority. Yeah, and in the UK, there are potentially a number of from all over England. They could be the south, they could be in the east, they could be the north. They're not disclosing where they are at the moment. I understand, but these will be communities around the country who have identified an opportunity. Either they may be an existing nuclear community where decommissioning is taking place and there's going to be a negative impact on the economy. They could be an industrial brownfield area which have huge amounts of disused land, and they're looking to find some economic purpose for it and to regenerate and create jobs and economic activity in their area. So there'll be multiple motivations why people are coming to this. And then they'll want to then to share this and have this discussion with their wider community, their neighbours. We think this is a good idea, and these are the benefits. These are the risks. We believe we should be discussing this in a more formal way. So those discussions will take place initially. One would have thought in organised, facilitated public meetings actually within the communities. How then it evolves from there will be driven as much by that community. Is it geographically diverse? Is it geographically tight? There'll be different ways in which it then evolves. But there's a difficulty in sustaining that debate over 30 years. And if you go to Sweden, they're at the end of a process that's taken almost 30 years. And it's not always easy to sustain a public dialogue over 30 years when often there's not much to talk about. It might take 2 years to do the borehole investigations. And so in Britain, they've built in this process of talking about, the community will be given investment funding for the long term. So alongside the work they're doing while they're analysing the geology and the technical requirements, there'll be a lot of discussion within the community about, what does the community want? And funding made available for whether that be affordable housing, whether that be new road networks, whatever that community feels is important to give it a sustainable future.
And does that ever get perceived as this is a payoff? Like we're paying you off to take something undesirable, and the way that we're paying you is we're going to build a new road for you. Does it ever come across that way?
Yes, it does. And it's the first default position of most people. Though somebody pointed out, one of the local authority leaders at a meeting, that certainly in the United Kingdom, you can't build a roundabout in a neighbourhood without somebody turning out wanting compensation. If you didn't offer compensation, the public will want to know why not. If you do offer compensation, you're bribing us. You're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
So what do we do about that?
And that's why you need to have a much more. It isn't just about the money. It is about what does it you as a community want, and for the community itself to feel engaged and involved in a process over the longer term. Because, a facility like this will be operating in the UK for 150 to 200 years. That's consistent work. And if you listen to the municipality of Carlsbad, they see WIP as other industries come and go. They have boom and busts, but the radioactive waste is a constant, steady stream of business that attracts high-skill, high-paid jobs and creates, a centre that also continues to attract high-skilled, high-paid people, which is beneficial to their economy. And certainly, you see that in the UK. When you get one sort of investment, I look at Harwell, which is where radioactive waste management are based. It is the oldest research facility in the UK, long since decommissioned, but it's now become the centre of a large science park. And national standing, because it attracted, and they carried on building the local economy. There's no longer any nuclear research done there. It was the foundations as they declined the nuclear site and built the science site. It's led to a much more sustainable long-term economic benefit for the area.
Great. So, Roy, as we wrap up here today, why don't you put on your magic hat, look forward 10 years in the future? What's changed?
I doubt very much has changed. I still think that we'll be in a situation, particularly of geological disposal, where a conversation is taking place in 4 or 5 different communities as research is looked at to the individual sites. And that what will have potentially have changed is the broader environment in which all this is happening. And I think this is more critical. So often the nuclear sector sort of looks at itself in isolation and in a vacuum. And in fact, the world is changing around us, and the values and the motivations that people have are changing. Generational outlooks are different. If we look at a generation born in the 1950s and 60s, their outlook and aspirations are very different from the outlook and aspirations of people born at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. And so this whole issue at the moment, the broader issue around nuclear about, is it a green technology? What contribution can it make to climate change? There would seem to be a growing environmental movement. We've got people like Michael Schellenberger in the United States, but over here in the UK, you have George Monbiot, and recently a leader of the Extinction Rebellion climate change group has moved across to be pro-nuclear on the basis that actually, if you look at the science and you look at the risk profile, if we don't address climate change and reduce carbon footprint, the world is in a much more dangerous position. If there is any risk associated with nuclear, it's a smaller one, because nuclear will help us achieve our carbon targets. And that is the more pressing and urgent issue. But I also think more generally that the other thing that's certainly in the UK, and it's probably true in the United States as well, one of the issues is political decision making. And that so many decisions are caught up in complex, short-term political decision making. We have forgotten as societies, how do we plan long-term for our needs? And certainly, you see infrastructure crumbling. It's the same in the UK as in the US. We've wanted to pay low taxes. We've not thought about continuously reinvesting in our infrastructure that actually supports how we live as a community. Nuclear is just one part of that. This wider sense, though, increasingly, I think what we're seeing now with the coronavirus, we're bringing it home, is a generation beginning to think, no, we need to plan better. We need to plan longer term. There are consequences to our actions. We cannot just keep throwing waste away. We have to reduce our consumption, think about how we manufacture, and then how we dispose of all wastes, not just radioactive. We need to think about the impact of our behaviours on our planet, and therefore plan accordingly, which is not something that has happened over the past 40, 50 years. We've been very much consumers. Consume, dispose, without really ever addressing or wanting to address the consequences of our actions. But I see now more generally, and again, not just nuclear, a changing mindset around the world. And the more I travel, I used to work in the internet industry in the 1990s and launched broadband digital and cable TV as a commercial product in the UK. And now I travel around the world doing what I'm doing with GDFWatch. And I see a very distinct change. When I first went to the United States in the 1970s as a teenager, I was very different from American teenagers. Very different world outlook, very different value outlook. I travel now, and the values and the world outlook are almost identical, whether you are in Asia, Europe, or the Americas. People seem to connect on a sort of horizontal across national boundaries rather than vertically within their countries. And that, for me, the world is beginning to, younger people or the societies are beginning to realize our longer term problems are not things we can deal with alone. These are issues that we have to deal with collectively. And nuclear is part of that discussion, both in terms of a difficult discussion because nuclear has its consequences, but what are the other consequences if we don't have nuclear? And so often in life, people seem to think not doing something or just stopping something is risk-free. No, it's not. It creates doing nothing in itself has risks. So I remain concerned, particularly when I think about radioactive waste. The longer we leave it on the surface, and the reason for burying it is that another ice age is going to come. There are going to be, the Northern Hemisphere in the UK is going to be covered with glaciers. Whether we like it or not, this is planetary change. I don't want to be responsible for a pile of toxin that just gets swept alone and is left to potentially damage. I know it's 100,000 years, and we shouldn't be thinking about it, but I do think morally and ethically, those are the sorts of considerations this generation takes seriously, and it's one that we should work towards reinforcing and changing. If that will that make sense?
Well, except for the part about us worrying about radioactive waste when an ice age has come and wiped everyone else out. But I'll leave it at that. Roy Payne, thank you so much for your time on Titans of Nuclear today.
Good to meet you, Bret. Take care.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.